Battlemages would, in almost any iteration of any fantasy world, be absolutely terrifying and a devastating force on the battlefield, whether they are the 1 in a million magic caster, like for example Melisandre in Game of Thrones, whom's fairly subtle influence shattered the cohesion of a superior force by eliminating its leader, or if they are just a regular part of any army from the perspective of a medieval fantasy world, where they work along regular, non-magical troops. And I think we will start with the second scenario, where mages are an almost normal part of any army. In this very much high fantasy setting, these battle mages would be but a small part of the overall number of mages in any realm, simply because there's much more money in civilian applications of magic, such as rituals of constructions, spells of healing and mending, incantations that can fertilize entire fields, and a chant compelling Saul to leave the water. All of this would be in general much more useful than being able to cast a good old fireball spell and roast your enemies. Not to mention that magic item production would allow the many nations of any fantasy world to be much more prosperous and settle much more hostile lands. And even in a normal village on the countryside, I know Khan isn't exactly normal, but still, even there, items are used. And specifically, a magic item was used by Henry Emmott to produce clean water out of literally nothing. Meaning, while she still was a medieval peasant girl, she had now a reliable source of drinking water and water to water the fields during a drought, simply because of magic, making her life much more comfortable and secure. But of course, being able to remove certain substances from liquids could also be used offensively. I mean, just altering the pH of your opponent's blood slightly might be enough to render him combat ineffective, or just downright end his life. And being able to produce tiny CO2 clouds, or just concentrate the nitrogen in the air so that the victim asphyxiates without even knowing that he's attacked, is still very dangerous, and some utility mages would excel in this. If you can conjure rain clouds, you could perhaps with enough training also conjure up thunder clouds and unleash lightning strikes, create torrential downpours that turn the field into mud, thus breaking any cavalry charges. And if you are a magical smith, you could perhaps forge some items with the aid of a magical flame that you yourself create, or you could perhaps control and bend steel and other metals to your very liking. And professions like these would be then the recruitment pool of any magical combat units. As for what the army would be looking for, well, first and foremost, 4 healers of course. People able to mend broken bones, close flesh wounds before one's eyes, and also cure illnesses, which were in pre-modern times a great, if not a greater killer for soldiers than the actual fighting itself. And especially commanders would have their personal medical corps at hand, and these healers would also be used to mend any illnesses during active fighting, because since magic is so deadly to non-magical combatants, the wars would be fought at a distance, behind cover, and with far more ranged units, for example crossbowmen or musketeers, rather than knights in shining armor clashing in epic battles. But still, knights, as in melee-focused units, would still be a thing. But rather than forming tightly packed units, they would rely on their magical armor, their cover, their magical runes of speed and strength, endurance and healing, in order to basically become superhuman, and then take out enemy crossbow units, and enemy ranged units in general, and perhaps the odd and unattentive mage here and there, in close quarters combat. Simply speaking, these armored knights, who did not need to be magical in nature, but simply need to be clad head to toe in magical armor produced by magical smiths, would simply try to close in on ranged units of the enemy, while their own knights, of course, would fend off any attempts of them coming anywhere near the crossbow units. And of course their enemy mages would also try to stop them. Another thing Battlemages themselves would be used for are air raids, casting the fly spell, perhaps use another spell of invincibility or a cloud for cover, and then unleash fireball or detonation magic upon unsuspecting enemies. Battlemage Beastmasters could also be used, especially if they are very powerful, and therefore can dominate griffins or wyverns and other beasts that perhaps are above anything normal humans could normally tame. And of course, in order to protect one's own airspace or attack enemies from above, these units would then be recruited and employed on the battlefield. And another unit of magic casters would also be in almost any army, and could perhaps be even the core strategy behind any larger army, namely the bombardment units. Overlord has done a great job of illustrating how devastating those units would be. Thanks to spells like Fireball, entire units could be wiped out with just one hit. And having multiple casters specializing in those abilities would enable the army to take any point under sustained fire. These bombardment units would be essentially the equivalent to the Queen of Battlefield, the artillery in our own time. So again, things like trenches and cover would be extremely important for any army, as would be magical units specializing in countering incoming fire, or water, or gigantic boulders, and anything else one can fling at men in order to force them to quit their breathing habit. Basically, if the enemy side flings a fireball, you try to hit this ball of fire with a ball of water of your very own. If dust, mist, ash, or gas is blown to your very own side, a powerful wind gust will deflect the encroaching fog. Or they would indeed create magical shields, like those seen in the Battle of Hogwarts, that simply would withstand any fireball spells, as long as it is maintained and mended by the battle wizards specialized in barrier magic. And of course, cloaking and spells of invisibility, as well as spells of detection and scrying would play a very great role on any magical battlefield. Basically, information warfare would become very important very quickly if enough magic is involved. And in general, any magical unit would be specialized. The bombardment squad would not also be a healer squad or barrier casters, and of course augmentative magic would also be cast by specialists in order to make regular troops more effective and resilient to arrows, crossbow bolts, and lightning bolts, so that even normal men could be hit by devastating magic and at the very least survive long enough for the healers to fix them up. And speaking of normal men, they will again not being able to cast magic, but they still would play an important role on any battlefield, and indeed make up most of the units. And the reason for why nations would still employ non-magical combatants is very simple. They are, in all likelihood, vastly cheaper. And if it takes 10 years to educate and train even the most basic magic caster up, costing the equivalent of 20 or even 50 peasant bowmen in terms of resources, then having 10 of these bowmen take out one of these magic casters at the cost of their own lives would still be a huge victory for your own side, even though your losses are 10 times that of the enemy. And even simple cannon fodder would have one very vital role to play. If they needed to be bombarded, to be forced out of their entrenchments, if the forest needs to be torched so that these bowmen are out of cover, the enemy still has to expand a huge chunk of mana due to all of this. And it might not nearly render enough soldiers' combat ineffective to justify such a huge mana expanse. So if an army can bring enough non-magical casters to bear, the army can simply exhaust the enemy caster's mana pool before its own battle mages charge in. So in conclusion, battle mages would be expensive to train, but they're extremely effective on the battlefield, while non-magical ranged units would be far cheaper, far more numerous, and at a huge disadvantage until the casters run out of mana. And then a couple of angry peasants are descending upon an old frail man in colorful attire. But what about the opposite? What if magical casters are rare, as in your side will have 50,000 men under arms and 5 casters able to use fireball? How would they then affect the battlefield? Well, they would of course tear apart tightly packed infantry formations, prevent cavalry from charging by creating quagmires under their very hoofs, and of course they could also be used to teleport behind enemy leaders, backstab them, and then teleport away, and the entire thing would be a very one-sided battle. But the biggest impact these casters would have would be the absolute devastation that they would cause to the morale of the enemy army. If you see your fellow men be burned to a crisp because one old man shouted something at them with a booming voice, chances are you will look for employment elsewhere and leave your workplace in great hurry, rather than risking the same to be done to you. And this might surprise you, but this would also not be a great scenario for the battle mages themselves, because they would be a prime target for any assassin, any intriguing and scheming lord that seeks to weaken its king's power, for any enemy crossbowman, for ballistas and scorpion bolts, anything that could bring down one of the 5 OP battle mages your side has will be sent after them. And if the enemy also has 5 mages on their side, then they would also be used on the battlefield, on the very same that your mages are used, meaning that one-on-one battles between battle mages would occur, and they would be extremely epic to watch, but horrific to fight, since even if your side, your mage, could defeat the enemy battle mage, chances are your mage will be low on mana now, and then he's just an old man in a war zone and needs to quickly withdraw, because the enemy will unleash everything they have to strike him down, to take the counterfrag for a lack of a better term. So being a magic caster, a being 1 in a million, would still come with considerable risks, not to mention the psychological impact of burning thousands of men alive on a semi-regular basis. And with that said, I think you now have a general idea how battle mages would affect a battlefield and what roles they would have to play. And with that said, I say thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again under my next video. Until then, have a nice day.